Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short audio presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the customer acquisition process. So the key here is to develop a deep and detailed understanding of the customer's purchasing process. The bottom line is that you've got to get out there. You've got to talk to customers, you've got to observe them, and you've got to figure out how they actually make these purchases in order to give yourself the best chance of completing sales. The product acquisition process is the mechanisms that customers utilize in order to ultimately identify and purchase whatever your product or service is. So as a startup, your goal is to figure out how customers can be systematically acquired, right? It's one thing to say, well, I'm going to call 10 people and get them to buy a t-shirt, but that's not going to work if you want to sell 50,000 t-shirts, right? So ultimately, there has to be a more systematic way to do this. So you need to understand how people make that purchasing process. How does it work? What does it cost to get this information in front of them? And then how long does it take for them to actually make the purchase? This is key to understanding the lifetime value of a customer, which is another key calculation that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. There are a number of key questions that you'll want to ask in order to best understand the acquisition process. How do customers determine they have a need? And/or what is that opportunity to move away from whatever it is they currently do now, whether they don't buy anything at all, or whether they buy a related product, or whether they buy a very similar product from a competitor. How customers will find out about your product. Do they hear about it on the radio? Do they see an ad on the web? How do they analyze your product? That is, what are the questions they ask themselves in order to think about how your product or service compares to other options? How do they acquire it? What do they actually do? This is usually where entrepreneurs take shortcuts. They say, well, they just buy it. Well, we understand that, but do they buy it online? Do they buy it in a store? Do they buy it with cash? Is there an invoice? Do they have it shipped? Do they pick it up? How do they install it in cases where it fits with something else they have or do? And then ultimately, what is the specific nature of the payment that they make? Do they buy it up front all at once? Do they make installment payments? Is it a recurring payment? Do they pay with PayPal? Do they pay with cash? And so on and so forth. You also need to think carefully about the key players from the decision-making unit that will be involved. So who are the key people? Is there a champion? Is there an influencer? Is there an economic buyer? What influence do they have, and what budget authority do they have? That is, do more than one person have to be involved in making a decision? How long will it take to complete each component process that you identify? And what are the inputs and outputs of this step? So it's really important to recognize that some purchases are really, really simple, right? So you want to sell a t-shirt, you call 3 friends, and one of them agrees to buy the t-shirt. That's great. But if you're selling an $80,000 piece of machinery, or you're selling enterprise software, anything more complicated, it's just not going to be as simple as we're showing it here in the class. And you can go through this process to become sophisticated because your goal is ultimately to be able to do this as efficiently and inexpensively as possible. A good way to think about this is to use the metaphor of the customer journey, right? So you imagine that a customer has this journey experience from the first time they ever encounter your product or service to the point that they're committed to it for the long haul, not just to the purchase point, but beyond the purchase through support to the point where they're advocating on your behalf or they're choosing to repurchase it over time. And we often create a customer journey map, an actual visual representation of the experience that the customer has in order to really see where the opportunities are to influence that journey, to point the customer in the right direction, to get them the information that they need in order to make a decision. And I've provided an example for you here for health insurance. And this was put together by a separate organization called Heart of the Customer. But this is the level of sophistication that you would ultimately want to get to for a more complex product or service. And you can see that there's these phases that customers go through. Awareness, where they realize they do need a product or the service. That there's research that they're going to do in this case to try to figure out what their options are. choice reduction. That is, I had 10 choices, but I've got to narrow that down to 1 or 2. And then the actual purchase itself. Notice that for this example, we're talking about a very specific segment, that is young families, and there's information there that they've thought about how this journey might differ for this type of customer segment than for others. And if you're going to be a successful entrepreneur, you would want to then be able to create journey maps for each of the different customer segments, because they will have different experiences as they purchase products. Disciplined entrepreneurship describes a process designed to discover how you can standardize your sales process. Sometimes it's necessary to work with customers in an inefficient way, right? So this is the crawl and then walk before you can run. And so we think about this in the context of you might ultimately want to have a highly standardized process where people are getting the information online, submitting requests for quotes. You have an automated system for getting quotes to them, and then they can make the purchase online. But the very first couple times you go through this, that might not be the best way to do it, because you really want to understand what your customers are actually doing. And so you might have a very inefficient process in which you do talk to customers as they're going through the purchasing experience in order to figure out what information do they really need and so on. But ultimately, your goal is to get to this point of something that's much more standardized and efficient. The learning curve associated with sales often means that the people who do sales at the beginning may not be the people who ultimately do sales at the end. And very often with entrepreneurial ventures, it's the founders who are doing sales at the beginning, but ultimately as the organization begins to grow and there are more responsibilities, other salespeople are brought in as a specialized function in order to help continue to build the company. It's really important to recognize that this process can be quite time-consuming. You might think, well, I'll just start calling people and making sales. But as you might discover in this course with the t-shirt project, as well as in any other situation, often the time required is much more extensive. And you need to remember that you have to take into account all the times that you go through the sales process and don't make a sale, right? So there's a lead generation effort to figure out who your potential purchasers are. Maybe you have to have time, you need time to get access to influencers, or maybe if there are you're selling to businesses, there are engineers at the company that you have to talk to if your product has to be integrated with theirs. There could be a design phase and the distribution pipeline, that is having product available throughout your distribution system such that when sales are made, it can be shipped quickly or made available quickly. There can be installation efforts, process of figuring out payment terms if it's extremely expensive, and so on. Don't underestimate this. The t-shirt project's a wonderful way to kind of get a sense of it, but it's not the way that the majority of sales actually happens. I want to give you a quick example. I'm going to show you a 1-minute video of a product called the Doc Technologies Time Band, which is used in hospital settings so that surgeons and other care providers can keep track of how long activities has been going on. This can be very important with things like anesthesia and surgical procedures. And I want you to think about, if, given how this product works, what would the sales process look like in terms of who you would want to talk to, who might the influencers be, and so on. So watch this 1-minute video real quickly, and while you're watching it, think about, if you were Doc Technologies, what would your sales process look like?
Introducing the Insight Time Band, a first-of-its-kind timing wristband that sits directly on the patient. This 1-minute video will show you how to add the time band to your care pathways. The timer will start when snapped into place. This time-lapse shows the time band counting up minute by minute. To document a time, hold the Save button until the bar flashes. The time band can hold over a dozen times and will run for 10 hours. No matter where your patient goes, the time is always in your line of sight.
So even from that very quick video describing what the product actually does, you probably began to get some thoughts about some of the people who might be involved in deciding whether or not a care facility like a hospital should begin using that particular product. And you might have imagined maybe a nurse might be involved in that purchasing decision, or maybe the doctor themselves or the anesthesiologist. But remember that care facilities, especially places like hospitals, will have purchasing departments or specific people responsible for choosing which products to make available. If the product was more expensive, or many of them needed to be purchased, it's quite possible that to sell these you'd have to end up speaking to a finance department or a chief financial officer. And you might also end up having conversations with people in supplies or inventory management or inventory department at these kinds of organizations. In some cases, you might have to speak to all of these different people because any one of them might be an influencer or potentially a veto power as this product is getting purchased. It's important to also recognize that there's a distinction between selling business to business and business to consumer. Most of what you have probably experienced is business to consumer purchasing. That is, a company like Nike is selling shoes to a consumer. That is, you who buys the shoes and actually wears them. And B2C is obviously a very big and important selling process. The vast majority of things that we directly interact with are things we buy, whether it's food or chairs or whatever it happens to be. But remember that business to business is an enormous sector. And in some ways, being in a business opportunity where you're selling to other businesses has some very favorable attributes. Very often the value proposition is clear because what you're selling to a company, they're going to use in a very specific way to make money. And so it's very obvious what the characteristics of that product or service are that are valuable to them. You can clearly identify the need. Because you know what type of organization they are, you know what they produce, and you can tell whether or not they're going to need your product. And sometimes that sales process is potentially easier and cheaper to standardize because all the type of customers that you would sell to are likely to all be similar, and they'll have similar people and titles that give you clues about who you need to talk to. And once you've begun selling to one of them, you probably have a pretty good idea of the message and the story to be able to sell to more of them. Here are the key takeaways for customer acquisition. It's really important to recognize that a detailed and intimate understanding of the customer's process is critical. If you understand your customers, if you know how they think and you know how they behave, then you probably have a pretty good idea of what you're going to have to do in order to sell them. Doing that usually requires talking to them, if not observing them. And so to do this effectively, we say you have to get out of the building. You usually can't build effective sales processes by sitting in your room, sitting in your office, and simply trying to do research online. You need to get up, you need to get out, you need to talk to customers, you need to meet with them and see them and observe them. And that's going to give you the insight you need into the purchasing process that you need to implement.